Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Daily Bolt with your host, Dr. Jeff Tilley. Today's topic, Issues in Science Education, Part 7. Education versus Indoctrination. Okay, I could have added more to that title, but I'm just going to leave it there and leave it short. This is a topic that has received considerable play in the news media over the past several years or so. There are particular commentators that touch on this subject on a fairly regular basis, and it even reared its ugly head once again today after the publishing of an op-ed piece by a Dutch professor analyzing The Lion King in a specific way. What you think about that piece really doesn't have any bearing on this particular topic. What I'm going to try and address here is how much indoctrination does happen within the educational system. Is it a bad thing? Is it a good thing? Should it stop? Can it stop? I think the answers to those questions are more complex and difficult to get a handle on than many media outlets would like to have you believe it. But there are some signs that some of the issues are becoming a bit more direct, a bit more blatant than they have been in the past. Usually, when this subject has come up over the past several decades, often the idea of academic freedom is brought up and discussed as a part of the conversation. Academic freedom basically means that someone who is tenured at a university in particular, but in theory it's supposed to be everybody, has the right to teach their class the way that they deem best. Now, given people are individuals and individuals have opinions, there are almost countless ways that someone's individual bias might get into a course. It can be in terms of how they want to evaluate the students. That's a fairly simple one. It can be directly in terms of content. So, and with that basically meaning that the teachers' or professors' opinions become part and parcel of the material that's taught, whether it's done intentionally or unintentionally. It's almost impossible to entirely avoid some bias in any class that's taught on the part of the person who's teaching it, because ultimately they base part of their teaching style, their approach, even their knowledge on their experiences. And so it's almost impossible to avoid some degree of what could be called indoctrination within the concept and the framework of academic freedom. So, be that as it may, the debate in recent years has been, is there something systematic going on? Now, this is different. Something systematic, which would basically be described or defined as an attempt to deliberately teach a particular ideology, particular point of view, particular worldview, particular way of seeing any subject by teachers, by professors. This has been charged by several on the more right-leaning media as occurring in colleges and universities. And I will say that I have seen some of this myself in my own experience. I see teachers who definitely make attempts to teach what they think is right and wrong, even if it's in a subject that should not really have that type of subjectivity. And this is the key. The subjectivity, whether it's appropriate or not. You're in a political science class, you're having a debate about various philosophies. It will be subjective because everyone has an opinion, and it can be based on policy, it can be based on law, but ultimately you will see a lot of opinions, and a lot of political science classes stage debates as a way to encourage people to learn how to think, how to express their opinions, and hopefully, how to understand other people's opinions better. And I say hopefully because I'm not necessarily sure, based on the level of social media and mainstream media discourse that we see these days, where that's actually occurring. If anything, people seem to be less able to understand someone's opinion if it is different from theirs, or there's very little tolerance for that, which suggests that perhaps that latter part of any political science debate class is not working very well, not being very successful. Now, as a scientist, whether it's physical science or social science, there is supposed to be a degree of objectivity in terms of the science information that's presented. So for the remainder of this podcast, I'm going to focus mostly on that aspect of this particular subject because I've been a physical science researcher, I've been a physical science teacher. In the last couple of years, I've even taught more in the way of a bit of social sciences, in particular with respect to classes in regional geography. So, is all of this content in terms of the sciences being presented objectively, whether it being in terms of a professor's academic freedom or in terms of textbooks? Here I can say, based on the experience I've had, and it's my experience alone, as the saying goes, your mileage may vary, but I have certainly seen this. I have certainly seen a turn in science teaching away from objectivity and more towards the subjectivity, either the teacher or the professor's opinions, or even more insidious, how textbooks are put together. Now, the whole subject of textbooks can be viewed as another aspect of this particular question, indoctrination versus education. After all, it's been said that the history books are written by whoever wins, and that there's a certain amount of truth to that. And some textbooks are now being written to try and go completely against that grain and even alter the perception of various historical facts within a current context. The problem is that that's not really a valid approach. What happened in 1500 happened in 1500 for the reasons and the societal forces, the cultural forces, whether they be religious, socio-political, ethnic, whatever you want to call it, even physical. Whatever happened then in that context. This is an argument that is often applied even to biblical truths by religious scholars and those who teach religious studies classes. There is a certain degree of context that applies. There's a certain degree to which what happens and the lessons learned go beyond that context. Where's the dividing line? This is where the slope gets slippery, and where, in particular, as I've evaluated textbooks for courses and evaluated curriculum, I have the most concern. I see in particular for the hard sciences a shift away from what used to be outright abject objectivity in the presentation of science. Science is, as I've said in previous podcasts, rarely involved in proving something beyond any possible doubt. We have scientific theories that are backed up by evidence, and as new evidence comes in, theories might have to be changed or modified. This might even be happening now, as today there were reports from the newest edition of the journal Climate Change of a study by a group of researchers in Finland that are claiming they can find no evidence for a man-made component to climate change, possibly reopening that question. Now, here's the issue. Will that study ever be discussed in certain classes? And what I fear, from what I've seen, is probably not. There will be climatologists, climatology professors, meteorology professors, physical geography professors, you name it, that will pretend that that study doesn't exist because it contradicts their worldview and it contradicts what they see as their responsibility to teach what they think is right and wrong, what they think society should be like. Now, again, there are places in college classes in particular where that can be an appropriate educational approach. There can also be places in college curriculum, but especially in K through 12, where it is not appropriate. We should be teaching our young people how to think, how to look at evidence, how to evaluate that evidence and come to their own conclusions, and not believe something simply because it's in a textbook. This past year, I was part of a class that I was teaching, and the textbook shifted. I actually kind of liked the old textbook, but it was expensive, and the students protested having to spend a lot of money on a book for a general education course that they'd probably never use again, and there's a certain argument with that, which is fine. But the new textbook, which I had the ability to at least give input to, that input was ignored, and actually once I started working with the textbook, I had even stronger feelings about it. That textbook took deliberate positions and politicized many things that should not have been politicized. It had a worldview that was very much in tune with, unfortunately, what people like Tucker Carlson on Fox News talks about on a regular basis. The West is bad. Western Europe is made of bad people. They've made bad choices throughout their entire history. Eastern Europeans have suffered. Russians have suffered. Chinese have suffered. Everyone else has suffered. And it's blatant. That's what is distressing, is how blatant it is. It doesn't quite use that exact phrasing that I just gave you, but it chooses words and contexts for describing historical events that are emotionally charged and intended to elicit a particular response in a particular way, such that there would be no way of in their opinion, that anyone who is intelligent or educated should be able to argue another position. I remember even when I was in high school, we had in a history class a debate in which you had to look at the two sides of the Civil War, the North and the South. And the Civil War, as you all know, was really something that came about as a result of the issue of slavery and the differences of opinion between those states in the North and those states in the South. And sometimes you were assigned to debate a position you didn't agree with, and you still had to do it. Now, in a similar class that might be considered racist to even debate the question, or some other nonsense. And this is the whole thing with today's Washington Post op-ed piece, in which it's claimed that The Lion King is a fascist, racist, every possible, negative connotation of a story, of a film that children have grown up with and enjoyed and gotten life lessons from. It's a one-sided perspective, and it immediately denigrates any perspective that is not with the majority. And this is bad enough in history, this is bad enough in social sciences and political geography and regional geography, but it gets even worse in my mind when these type of problems invade the realm of physical science. And we're talking about it, you guessed it, climate change and the related science. So it's a trend I don't like. It's a trend that I wish could be reversed. I know I can't reverse it myself. I've come under fire personally for trying to teach a more balanced perspective, where you look at more than one side of an issue and you try to see the arguments for both. For climate change, you have the Finland study. There was another study last year that was also not going with the flow and with the grain of the bandwagon that everyone is on in many studies, saying that, climate change, of course, is man-made, blah, 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 which leads to all this debate, all this rancor, Green New Deal, you name it. But the problem here is not necessarily the fact that there's these arguments about science and policy. Those are actually very healthy as long as they happen fairly. The problem is, what are we teaching our kids? In many cases, this debate, this argument, these different contexts and perspectives not only don't get taught, but there is pressure not to teach them. And I've seen this myself and experienced it personally. So I'm speaking from my own experience. And if you don't like hearing that, I'm sorry, too bad. There is quite a lot of pressure within both K through 12 and especially higher education to teach a certain worldview and a certain viewpoint on many subjects. Maybe not all of them, but many of them. What you're seeing happening in American political discourse, as well as the lack of civility associated with it, is a direct outgrowth of what's been happening over the last 20 to 30 years. It's not often that I can agree wholeheartedly with a Tucker Carlson and his opinion on this, but I do agree with it this time. There has been indoctrination. It has been one-sided for the most part, and it is resulting in the situation we have now. That's food for thought. Hopefully, you've gotten something out of this podcast other than raised blood pressure. But if you did, try to realize there are other perspectives besides mine. And this podcast is my perspective. And fortunately, we still live in a country that entitles me to that. I hope you did get something to think about out of this podcast. And we'll continue this series with a few more podcasts before finishing it up. And then I'm going to come back to a little piece of what I've talked about in this podcast in another series that talks about issues with the science research establishment in the country and in the world. Some similar themes will come back. That's all I have for now. I'm Dr. Jeff Tilley. This is the Daily Bolt. Good night, good afternoon, good morning, whenever you're listening, and God bless.